Hello and welcome to Fort William, where the race is on to find the nicest guy and gals in the business. No, just kidding, they're all here to see who can absolutely go fastest. Now, since the last World Cup season, this motley crew behind me will have been going to some of the best riding destinations in the world, presumably staying in some of the cheapest accommodation to try and get their rigs to go as quickly as possible. It being the first downhill World Cup of the year, it's a great opportunity for us to see what they've got up to, as well as seeing what latest and greatest tech they have on offer. So this is Valentina Hull's brand new YT. Now, this bike has been shrouded in mystery, might be the way to talk about it, because of course it was running that large sort of cloth in the prototype pictures. But outside, behind that sheath, you could see peeking a little idler, which isn't apparent on this bike, but will be making an appearance during the racing. This is currently how the production bike will look, and that might be available further down the line as sort of an aftermarket add-on. So this bike will be raced this weekend with that idler, which will be attached later on. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to do it, but it'll probably become quite apparent in time, especially when we see the race footage and pictures. Now, looking at the bike, there are three notable exceptions to what you might expect if you've been following the sort of rumour mill of the past couple of weeks. So this bike, at least, doesn't have the flight attendant electric damping adjustment that you've seen in photos. Now, flight attendant basically will change the fork on the fly to affect the level of support, so it could theoretically be fully open for, the really chundery tech stuff, and then lock out or firm up for a long sloggy pedal. I wouldn't say that doesn't mean that she's not running it this weekend, at least they just don't want it on show. The second thing that you would be expecting to see on this bike, but isn't here, is that idler. Now, they are suggesting she'll be running it in the race either way. How it attaches though, I'm not really sure, and I wonder if we're running a different piece here, because there doesn't look to be any, any threads or anything to secure it. And I can't imagine they're just going to cable tie it on or give it a go with some electrical tape. The other thing which I think is interesting, to me at least, is on this down tube protection. If you look at Oisin's bike, you can actually see he's got some lead weights sort of custom made to fit that shape. I don't know if that's something that you can just swap out this whole plate or they just stick on there, but I think it's actually a really, really good way to do it. We've spoken about it before, but when you have a better ratio between the frame weight and the unsprung mass, it can mean the bike tracks better because it's less likely to lift the whole bike up and more likely to push the wheel into its stroke, which can give better small bump compliance. So this new bike has a couple of features that are definitely kind of fall in line with where you would expect a modern downhill bike to be. The chainstay adjustment, flip, chip to tweaks to the geometry, but it has got a bit of an ace up its sleeve. And this whole link here can basically be run one of two ways to go between wheel sizes. So the whole link is what you flip, should you want to go between 27 or 29 in the rear. And honestly, it looks really, really smart. The whole bike, I think, looks very sleek, pretty good. The golden forks, I mean, it's interesting. So what Kashima is, which obviously this isn't, is surface that is something that Fox license from another brand. It's not something they kind of own themselves in a traditional sense. These aren't Kashima, but they are gold. And I mean, it looks very nice. I'd be interested to know how the patent wars will unfold if they ever try and bring this into production, but I imagine they'll just do it for a bit of eye candy this weekend. This is Oisin's bike, and it has some prototype TRP levers on. So they look like they've got that bike point and reach adjustment, and honestly, they look pretty close to production. They have all the mineral oil requirements, etc. And honestly, I actually saw this lever or an earlier version of it kicking around quite a long time ago, and they must be pretty close now to finally getting out into production. So behind me is Amaury Pierron's Commencal Supreme V, whatever it is now. Now this bike, which has a 6-bar rear end, was one of the kind of first production downhill bikes in recent years to go to an adjustment for the flex. There was that bridge which you could remove entirely, or you could put, different stiffnesses in to tailor the feel to your desired preference. Now, if you look on the back there, they've accidentally put the chainstay off a 1970s steel road bike on there. it is incredibly thin, almost delicate. However, it's not the thinness of the chainstay that should be catching your eye, because concealed behind the cranks and just behind that seat tube, you can actually see a secondary bridge, which again looks to be adjustable. So if there wasn't enough adjustment before, then you can find it afterwards. Now, frame flex is a really interesting thing, because if you have something too stiff, it means that, we've had something very stiff, I should say, it means that it really isolates sort of lateral forces from the shock, which is great. The shock's very happy. If it is too stiff, though, it can sort of jar and it refuses to track because it only wants to work exactly in the plane that it's sat on. Too flexy, of course, and it feels, well, it feels like a bit of a waterbed. It's all about getting it just right. And this adjustment will let them blend the production bike to the preference of the elite rider, as well as your average Joes, should someone like me swing a leg over it. So behind me, we have the Cube 215. Now, this bike looked production ready about 2 years ago, but it's seen constant refinement, and now it is basically nearly production ready, apparently. So the production bike, however, won't have this contraption on the back. What is this? Well, it's a way to adjust something called anti-rise. Now, this bike without this arm has an anti-rise value of just over 100%, which basically means the suspension will have a likelihood to squat under heavy braking. And with this system, it isolates that force away from the suspension, reducing it to apparently below 20%. So you can imagine the force it passes on is about 1/5. Now, anti-rise is something that really is a personal preference, and to me at least, there isn't a good or a bad value. It just depends what the overall package does in terms of chassis stability to deliver. But because these riders are pushing so hard, they're finding, when they're setting up through rough braking sections into turns, the last thing they want is the suspension to pretty much already be used up by the braking. And it can't work, for the hits, because they brake so aggressively and so late. So probably won't be a production thing. It's definitely been tried before. Lots of brands have had little dalliance with it. But it's interesting to see all these Cube riders with this independent braking arm, and apparently they really just got to notice the difference when they go back, and they also see the difference in the timings. So we're here at Intense Factory with Joe Breeden's bike. Now, this bike has loads of small details and interesting mods, but the thing I'm going to talk about today is the remote lockout, which is basically a repurposed, I suppose, front derailleur shifter. I think it's a Shimano SLX one. And that plays very nicely with the multiple sort of settings of the high-speed compression adjustment on the Olin shock, which is very useful if you've got a track that is very demanding, as well as having a long slog. And to be honest, I think it's far more useful than any electronic gubbins you're going to see on Valley Hole's bike, which I don't really get along with. I'd much rather have something like this, personally. There's loads going on with this bike, which will probably come out in due course, but I think that remote lockout is really, really smart. So behind me is the Orbea pit, but they aren't here. However, I know the skin on this one, so I thought I would share it. Martin Maes this weekend will be riding a non-e-bike version of their e-bike. So they've basically taken the battery and the rotor out and increased the travel to 200 mil. So whilst that's cool, the interesting bit is basically how they've connected the cranks, because what they've been able to do a bit of machining. They can now choose exactly where they want their bottom bracket, as well as having sort of slots to put weights in to fine-tune the feel of the bike depending on the track. It also means they can not only adjust bottom bracket height, but also adjust fore-aft balance. Now, typically in the bike industry, when a bike says, oh, it's got different chainstay lengths, it's kind of not really true. What they've done is they've hung the bottom bracket from a different place on the frame, because this means they'd have to revise the kinematics constantly. So that's essentially what they can do on this bike, shuffling the bottom bracket forward and back to kind of fine-tune the feel. I think it's pretty cool. I would love to see Martin Maes on a real downhill bike, but it's better than having the enduro bike, which he was making an appearance with in Lord in 2022. And best of luck to him this weekend. The name's Bond, head tube Bond. Now, the Pivot guys did suffer quite a high-profile failure in the off-season. Speaking to them, it sounds like, they haven't done any major revisions to the frame, whatever. Maybe just one of those things. And let's not forget that, well, the relationship that a brand has with prototyping is, I think, really interesting. It's done slightly differently in the bike industry. it's a very high reward situation if you can show you're working and show this journey they go from what will be presumably eventually turn out to be a carbon bike that isn't lugged with all this machining. But it's also incredibly high risk because you're showing you're working, but you're also showing your failures. However, as an audience, I think it's really important that if we want to see this happen, we shouldn't be too surprised when sometimes it all goes a bit shits up. And so maybe, not cut them slack be the wrong word, but encourage brands to take risks and show their development publicly, because personally, I find it really interesting. So I found like we can't have our cake and eat it too and be like, what, you're doing that thing that's going to be rapidly changing and it's not perfect right away? Saying that, it was a bit, I'm glad to see everyone was okay because it could have been a lot worse. So we're here at NSUR and we have what isn't an Assegai, even though, let's face it, it looks quite similar. Lots and lots of brands are going to this style of tyre, which basically borrows quite a lot from what made tyres like maybe the Minion DHF quite successful, but incorporates these transfer lugs, which means it's basically smoother going from edge to edge, as well as having a bigger sort of braking paddle. As you can imagine there, it's going to have that big wall of knobs to really slow the bike down. Lots of brands are going to this style, and it's really, really popular for a front. And while you could say it is sort of a revised sort of Assegai-ish tyre, you could also say it's more like the Magic Mary, because that was arguably the tyre that really started off, and I think the lineage might start back with there. No real name for it, apart from Prototype plus 9, so make that of what you will. But yeah, looks pretty cool. And that's it. So it should be a pretty good race this weekend. I'm really excited. I think the thing I'm most looking forward to see how it goes is actually that Martin Maes e-bike. He says he's making an appearance, but I want to see him race the bloody thing. Thanks for watching, and get in the comments below. Who do you think the winners are going to be come Sunday? See you next time.